I'm going to try and weave some stuff into my talk to relate to some of the things that particularly Jill talked about this morning, and I may be more or less successful with that. As Richard said, I've been doing a lot of work on livestock genomics. I've been working on genomic selection in beef for feed efficiency, and which turns into reduced methane emissions, and also looking at genomic selection for disease resilience in pigs. And I'm not going to tell you too much about that, but some of the research results that I'm going to present, or descriptive statistics that I'm going to present, come from studies that are related to those particular research projects, although the actual results are at a much higher level. So if you have any questions about the genomics research, I'll be happy to deal with them at the end, because it has some interesting public and consumer outputs. Okay, so I was sitting in an airport yesterday after my class trying to get ready for this, and I realized that the World Economic Forum had released their Global Risks Report for 2017, which will be discussed at their meeting in Davos in a week or two. And this is not the public, remember, this is consumers. So this was their list of what the experts they interview globally thought were the top 10 risks for the next year in terms of likelihood and in terms of impact. So I was intrigued that there was an absence of technology, but that a lot of the things that they had on this list actually referred to different kinds of disruption. Food crises, of course, appear in their top 10 risks in terms of impact, so they're worried about it, but they're not sure it's that likely to happen in the next year. It becomes a little bit more interesting when they ask the people to look at their views of what they thought are the key emerging technologies, which of course now I can't possibly read, and you probably can't either, but things like 3D printing. The next one refers to although it's called advanced materials and information nanomaterials, the artificial intelligence and robotics one, biotechnologies, is still there. Embedded in some of these are the Internet of Things, and related to that some big data aspects, although they call them slightly different things. But when they asked the people about these technologies, all of which are potentially disruptive in the food system as well as other places, this is how they played out. What I found most interesting is where biotechnologies appears over here. So it is still considered to be fairly risky technology in terms of these experts. And I'm not sure whether they're saying the technology is risky or the introduction of the products of biotechnology is risky, basically because of what might happen. But if you read the text on the right hand, is it your right hand, side of this slide, they still seem to think that there's quite a bit of uncertainty about the long-term impacts. And so it's interesting that that is a view of people they consider experts or important managers, government officials, heads of companies in the world. If that kind of perception still exists for these kind of people, that there may still be problems we haven't foreseen, it's quite likely that the public perceptions of some of these things are also relevant. So that's just background because I was stuck in an airport, but it seems to be a little bit relevant to the kinds of things we're talking about at this conference today. This is basically where I want to start. This article caught my eye about a year and a half ago, where a group called the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network had commissioned Ipsos to do a survey about how Canadians felt about GM foods. I'm not entirely sure I think the results are all that earth-shattering. And my suspicion is, depending on the context in how the questions are asked, I'm not surprised at the results. But I am worried about the way these things get positioned in the press and the way these results are extrapolated to the population and how strongly the population actually feels about these things. So this one was largely about labeling, and unsurprisingly, the results would suggest that the vast majority of Canadians want GM products mandatorily labeled. Canadians and many people in the public in other countries are always going to vote for more information. They're always going to discount the costs associated with that extra information when they're asked for their opinion. And so this result is not really surprising. But what lies behind it, perhaps, is a little bit more interesting. This is a chart that, because I'm doing research on genomics, I pulled out of a very old Government of Canada publication that was asking people specifically about genomics, a subset of biotechnology, potentially the most benign use of biotechnology because it actually uses traditional breeding techniques with some extra information. And these survey questions, how familiar are you with the subject of genomics, which, by the way, could apply to people or agriculture or forestry or a variety of other contexts, were asked in 2001 and 2004. And at that point in time, between 3 and 5% of the population said they were very familiar. And between 25 and 36% of the population said they were not at all familiar. If we ask these same questions in 2006 and we would like to get rational responses from the public about what they believe needs to happen in terms of biotechnologies in general or genomics in specific in terms of policy responses and regulatory responses, we might suspect that the level of familiarity will have increased dramatically. These are the results that I've gotten over 2 iterations of asking exactly the same question with a bunch of background information provided for the participants. So the top 2 are the most recent ones. I got the pork results yesterday just before I left for the airport and the dairy results the week before Christmas, but I also asked the same questions in 2012 on 2 large national surveys with about 1,800 respondents. Interestingly enough, these were done through different panels maintained by different market research companies, about the same number of people. And guess what? We have fewer percentage of the population saying they're very familiar, and actually an increase in the number of people who are saying they're not at all familiar with these concepts. So on that basis, we probably don't expect the people to have changed their views about this particular technology, and the results are almost identical for biotechnology, by the way, in terms of what they want to see as policy responses. We also asked this question following these earlier studies of the federal government to find out whether they even had a positive or negative response to the idea of genomics after it was explained to them. And you can see that the vast majority of the people are neutral. Probably more of the population's on the negative side than on the positive side. And this is what we get in the more recent studies that I've done. An almost identical response. If anything, there's a minute movement towards the positive end of the scale rather than the neutral end of the scale. So in the period of time since 2004 up to 2012 anyway, we haven't really changed the overall Canadian national level of awareness, knowledge, acceptance, understanding of this particular concept. And perhaps that applies to a lot of other technologies that people are being faced with. Okay, we also have to remember that consumers have a number of hats. I, in general, talk about the public more nowadays than I do talk about consumers, because in many contexts, the public that is influencing policy, interfering with different types of disruption, are actually not consumers of the product. My research on animal welfare would show that non-consumers of meat products are much heavier influences of the policies around animal welfare, for example, than are consumers of meat products. So we have to remember that there are different hats that people wear. They're sometimes completely inconsistent in how they view the world through these different hats, and that you can unpack some of this from how they respond. These are some very old studies I did on related to nanotechnology and cloning animals for meat production and dairy production at the behest of the Alberta government way back when. And we did ask people what they were willing to pay for certain types of policies if they were asked to vote for them in a referendum. One of them was tracking the products of either nanotechnology or cloning from the farm to the final point of purchase at the grocery store. The other was making it mandatorily labeled, which is this contentious issue that keeps rearing its head. The other was banning its use. We were asking people how much they would be willing to spend in the context of the fact that they might have been spending $125 per week on food. And the numbers that come out of this are absolutely massive. Some of these, did I do that? Some of these people were essentially saying they would double their food budget. In essence, this is nonsense. Of course they don't want their food budgets to double, and of course there was no outcome from saying anything at a very high level in the survey, so of course there's a bias in the results considerably. But what it did say consistently is they really, really like the idea of tracking and labeling, perhaps even if they don't totally understand the technology. We asked these questions in the genomics research in 2012, and again, I changed it slightly, but the first two questions were exactly the same. Do you want the products of livestock that are genomically selected for certain traits to be tracked from the farm gate to the final consumer? Do you want them mandatorily labeled in the grocery store? Do you want to mandate that farmers have to use this technology because some of the outputs are good for society? Or do you want the government to spend more money on research of these technologies? And the really interesting thing is, yes, we absolutely want tracking, we absolutely want labeling that's consistent and statistically significant throughout the sample. Oh no, we don't want to tell farmers what to do. Those are all statistically insignificant for the vast majority of individual respondents to this survey. And we're not even entirely sure, but women, just so you know, we're very sure that we should spend more money on research on these technologies. So there's a complete milieu of lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, but anything that's going to give me more information is something that I'm going to vote for. Does that mean you don't like the technology? Does that mean you won't buy the technology if it appears in the grocery store? Does that tell you that you're going to respond negatively if it does get labeled or tracked from the farm gate? It doesn't tell you practically any of those things. Most recently, and this is from our dairy survey that we did that came back in December, we thought we would ask people exactly the same question. So, as an individual consumer, would you be willing to go to the grocery store and buy a more environmentally friendly dairy product? Could be milk or yogurt. Half the sample got milk, half the sample got yogurt. If it was the product of genomic selection for feed efficiency and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. What I want you to see is we then ask them, would you vote for an imposed policy that would mean that all dairy animals in the country would be selected for these things so that we would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the entire sector if it was going to cost you approximately the same amount of money? And I find it interesting that, that some of the things are very consistent. So, for example, the people that said that, yes, they would vote to purchase the more environmentally friendly milk, about 87% of them also voted to say they would vote in favor of mandatory regulation for the entire industry. So that's not too surprising. But you get down here that the people who said, no, I would never buy the improved environmentally friendly milk at a somewhat higher price, about 28% of them said, but I would vote for the regulation. You also find out that about 5% of the people who said they would always buy it themselves, if it was a choice in the grocery store, said that they wouldn't vote to have it mandatorily regulated across the country. And you get exactly the same patterns whether we ask those questions about milk or we ask those questions about yogurt. So there's some inconsistencies in what we see happening. We did explain to people that it would be money that they wouldn't have to spend on other things. We tried to be as credible as possible. We also explained that absolutely everybody would have to pay the higher price if 51% of the population voted in favor of the mandatory regulation for the industry. So people are a little bit split, and I guess in general, the majority of them like the idea of having their own choice in the grocery store more than they actually like the idea of imposing the regulation on the entire industry. Whether this is good or bad, or whether this is going to be an impediment to the adoption of new technologies, we're still not totally clear. Okay. The other aspect, as Jill mentioned this morning, is that we have to have trust and confidence in our regulators. And when I ask people, not on this chart by the way, but when I ask people who they trust in terms of their responsibility for the food system, the highest people on that list would be researchers and the government, and they're usually tied. So we have a lot of faith in the government's responsibility for the food system. But when you ask them specifically questions about the management of biotechnology, the results are less positive. These results are showing the people that feel strongly about the answers to these various questions, and the vast majority of them are negative, except for the actual negative comment, which is the government's too influenced by industry regarding biotechnology regulation. There's quite a bit of agreement with that in the public. In the most recent version of these questions, we also asked them a couple questions about whether they feel the government behaves fairly, because we're doing some research on how the concept of fair markets has an influence on people's decision-making. And we didn't even feel particularly strongly, positively, that the government was being fair in their decisions around biotechnology. So what does this mean? It means it's a problem area for policy processes. It means that this is probably, these feelings are probably contributing to the public's concerns about the adoption of technology, particularly biotechnology. It means they're probably heavily influenced by the press and by social media, who keep harping on these kinds of relationships between the government and industry, and the fact that the government may not be behaving in the best interests of the public when they deal with biotechnology. It belies the answers to the other questions, which say we trust the government most in terms of its management of the food system. So there's a dichotomy there that makes policy formation in this space a little bit difficult. I thought I would ask questions about the Arctic apple, and I guess I just thought I'd stick it in there for to see what you thought. I've said to people, you may or may not know that the Arctic apple has been approved and is likely going to be on sale in Canada in early 2017. Would you be likely to buy it? And it's really intriguing to me that the vast majority of the people are in the neutral to probably to definitely range, rather than in the definitely not to probably not range, although probably not is quite a big category on its own. And the results are pretty consistent across the two surveys that we did. We also asked them if they'd heard of the Arctic apple, and there was a little bit of difference between the people who had heard and the people who hadn't heard, but the vast majority had not heard about the apple before we brought it up. I was hoping that with the approval of the Arctic apple and the AquaVantage salmon this year, that we might get some people taking the high road and actually marketing them as GM products so that people could compare prices and they could actually compare how the product actually works. You can tell from Twitter or Facebook or any of the other sites that even some scientists are totally negative about the idea that we would ever tell voluntarily people in Canada about the GM content of our food. But I actually think that Canadians falling in this middle category are probably ripe to be convinced when they see how much GM we're already consuming and how safe that has already been for them. But until we resist the idea of labeling or providing the information that they're always going to ascribe a positive aspect to, we're probably never going to find that out. A couple other things that are going on that are really controversial and that are likely to rear their ugly head in some ways in our policy formation process. The whole idea of CRISPR is something that has gene editing effectively, is this new technology that is roaring ahead globally in China and in the US. The interesting thing in the US is the way the scientists describe it. They are gleeful about the fact that it does not have to go through the regulatory process that transgenic GM products had to do earlier. So they think they're escaping from the regulatory process to a certain extent. And they think it is great, and they say this loudly and longly, that nobody's going to be able to tell that it's been done after it's been done, and that it could be 100% heritable through the population of plant or animal that is gene edited. And they think that is all good. The last thing they think is good is that it's not going to be very many years before you can do it with a high school education. And I think all of those factors are things that are going to make the public incredibly concerned about this technology, and I kind of wish they would stop talking about it. The scientists themselves are saying there are worries about the ethics of using this even for plants or animals, but yet we're roaring ahead. So when the scientists get in a room and start talking about ethics, I think we need to consider what's going on at least. The interesting thing is that we're getting different relationships. Jill mentioned the cross-licensing of technologies today, and Monsanto made a big decision earlier this year to license the CRISPR technology from another organization that was further ahead. But the other organization put some serious riders on what Monsanto's allowed to do. They're not allowed to use it for gene drive, and they're not allowed to use it to create sterile terminator seeds, and they're not allowed to use it, interestingly enough, for anything that might affect tobacco that might be used for smoking. So I think that that is kind of interesting that there are changes around this technology in terms of some of the licensing agreements that are going on. Which doesn't mean, though, that Canada gets out of this in terms of a policy sense. The way our legislation is written around biotechnology products means we are going to have to consider some of the gene-edited products. And potentially having different rules with the US is going to impose some kind of trade barrier. So gene editing hasn't gone away in terms of a policy issue that we're going to deal with. I don't think the public's going to like it when the NGOs start attacking it in a big way if they decide to, because I think some of the so-called positives from the science end are going to be seen as negatives, and I very much worry about how much more negative some of those policy questions might end up being in our public opinion surveys. The other aspect of GM that was interesting in the past 12 months in the US that we haven't totally dealt with in Canada yet is this whole idea of mandatory GMO labeling. Interestingly enough, little old Vermont was going to have a mandatory law that came into effect the 1st of July, and what happened, the first thing that happened in 2016 was Campbell's made their decision that they couldn't be bothered marketing different lines of soup for Vermont, so they were just going to label for the whole country in the US. And shortly after that, General Mills said that so would they, and then ConAgra, Mars, and Kellogg's also followed suit and said, okay, we can't be bothered dealing with Vermont as a separate market either. We're going to go straight ahead and voluntarily put GM labels on our products, which is an interesting evolution in the supply chain. However, they definitely decided, courtesy of the Toronto Star, that they would not do the same thing for Canadian consumers. I think this is, again, something that's potentially fraught. A vast majority of Canadians spend some time in American grocery stores, and when they see the same products without having the same labels in Canada versus the US, That's where the lack of transparency is going to start biting and making the Canadians a little bit more suspicious about what's going on. If I buy my Cheerios in the US and it says it contains, Cheerios a bad example because it's a non-GMO one now for General Mills, but one of the cereal products and it says contains GMO elements in the US and I come back to Canada and it doesn't, makes me think, what, are they hiding something from me? Or is it actually a different product in Canada? And they won't have the answer to that question easily. So I think it's a pity these companies decided not to extend the labeling into Canada in some senses so we could get an actual response from the marketplace. The other thing that happened with the GMO labeling that caused a lot of contention is that the federal government in the US decided they finally had to have some kind of rule, and they came up with a rule that said there needed to be some form of food disclosure. It could be text or a symbol or electronic or digital link on the products to identify GM ingredients. And there's a huge amount of controversy because the pro-labeling people say that's not enough and the anti-labeling people say it's too much. But it's really intriguing because I think increasingly the electronic or digital link is actually going to be how we're looking for all the information in our food. So is this really controversial or not? The question for Canada is, if this is sitting in our biggest trade partner south of the border and many of the companies are already voluntarily labeling, where are we going to come out on this whole question? And how are we going to maintain transparency and trust with our public? At the same time, the US came out with a different way of saying that things were non-GMO, which we don't have a government process for doing that in Canada, although we have a private process for doing it. And it looks like, according to the non-GMO people, that they're on a real winner, just like gluten-free. It seems like non-anything is a good way of selling more food products. Lactose-free, gluten-free, fat-free, genetically modified-free, that all just seems good to the consumers, and there's been a big increase in sales associated with that in the US. So are we getting the same bump in Canada? The results would say at a smaller level. Just a couple other aspects of technology that I think that we're underestimating the disruptive effect. Recently in the Australian Financial Review, they started talking about how wheat farmers are using blockchain technology to sell grain, and they're finding it fast and reliable. And there's, if you read the whole article, there's a disruptive element that is encouraging wheat farmers to sell their grain this way. What I thought it was interesting was that they made some mention of the fact, and I've put the quote here, that this may give the farmers the same sense of security that they used to get from having the Alberta Wheat Board guarantee the payments for the grain. And so I thought, okay, well, so maybe technology will take a lot of the uncertainty out of marketing grain, and maybe that's a good thing for our grain farmers. We know that there's a vast amount of technology going on in people's phones and what they can do with food, and I think we're underestimating how that's going to change every aspect of how we market. This new smartphone, for example, can tell you almost everything about any food product that you pick up in the grocery store. The phone's makers say it can sense spoiled milk, a drink's alcohol content, a food's ingredients, counterfeit pills, poison, and nearly anything else, including GM ingredients if they're transgenic, but not including products of gene editing, of course, because those will be invisible. So with that in your hand when you go to the grocery store, are you really going to care about a mandatory label by print? And the last thing is that we are probably underestimating by the Internet of Things how much our fridge is going to be ordering our food for us in the future. And are we going to spend hours and hours programming our fridge to pick out the technologies that are being used to produce the foods that they're allowed to order from the Internet when they need to replace things in the fridge? Or are we going to ultimately let the fridge decide for us what the best thing for us? We'll probably have to put our BMI in and a few other things, and then the fridge will decide what we're allowed to eat or not. And maybe it won't care about technology since it is a product of technology. So we don't know all the ways disruption is going to occur that's going to affect consumer behavior. Experts, though, think many aspects of new technology still show great risks, which is concerning because it's going to affect the level of adoption and the level of certainty that the public feels about the technologies. Hence, there will be a need for various forms of policy intervention. We're going to need agile policy to be able to handle the agile technologies. Our policy responses are going to have to be quick because a lot of stuff with gene editing is already through the system and is likely already going to show up in imported products to Canada, and we haven't really considered what we want to do about that technology. And in areas where our rules differ from trading partners, we may face potentially costly disruptions in supply chains if we want to stop things at the border because our rules differ. Thank you.